This is a very special edition of tonight's program. Professor Adebayo Olukoshi is here with us, and he has participated in the production of an important book. He's been in Ghana over the last few days or so, delivering an important lecture on the platform of the CIMG. This book is entitled Democratic Transitions, and talking about transition at this time in Ghana is very useful, isn't it? Because we're about to go into an election on the 7th of December, and we may very well have a transition. Even if the incumbent wins, there's a transition of sorts, because the constitution would have ended the old administration and the new one would have to start. But transitions become more complicated when the key actors are changing, and that's what we'll find out in this book. Now, Professor Adebayo has been doing a lot of work in this area, and he reports to us that the things that we have taken for granted in Ghana, especially in our transition of 2000 and 2008, were not actually to be taken for granted, that a lot of work had gone on behind the scenes. Bottom line is that Mr. Rawlings may not have handed over. It didn't just happen, that a lot of work went into it. Also, that Mr. Kufour may not just have handed over, actually, incidentally, that a lot of work went into that. We'll find out from him what kind of work went into it. And as we approach another transition, should we believe that everything will be fine? His suggestion to us that until a few things are done, not everything could be fine. He has a good story about what happened in Benin recently, where the transition almost did not happen. He has an interesting story about Latin America, Chile, all of those places. This book has documented some of the difficult and controversial transitions that have occurred. It's entitled Democratic Transitions, Conversations with World Leaders, and it's put together by IDEA. We'll hear about IDEA as part of this program. So sit back and enjoy it, and let's take this matter very seriously, because a transition, if it should happen, may not actually occur if certain things are not done. Thank you very much, Professor Adebayo, for coming. It's a pleasure to see you.
Same here.
Is this your first time in Ghana?
No, not at all. I've been a very regular visitor to Ghana.
I see.
I consider myself something of a homeboy.
Many Nigerians consider themselves so too. What informed the production of this book, Democratic Transitions?
Well, the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance is an intergovernmental organization which was set up 22 years ago as the only intergovernmental organization actually that is dedicated exclusively to the promotion of democracy worldwide. In the course of the last 20 or so years of our work, especially on the African continent, in Latin America and Asia, it became quite clear that what people have celebrated in Africa as the second liberation, the new wave of democratic processes that we saw from the 1990s, and in some other contexts have called it third wave of democratization on a global scale, were not exactly as simple as they appeared.
That they were not simple means that the incumbents did not want to hand over?
Well, that there were complications of various kinds around most of the significant transitions that occurred.
Well,
and those complications were informed by a variety of factors, including the fact that many accustomed incumbents were not going to yield power easily, and certainly not before a negotiation.
Many accustomed incumbents were not going to yield power easily.
Exactly. And
not before a negotiation. So why was Ghana's transition in 2000, even though it was prescribed, and that would be the first major transition of the 21st century within the African context in the year 2000. That would probably be the first transition. 2001.
Alternation, yes.
Yes, the first alteration from an elected leader exiting for another elected leader. So Ghana sort of led the way in that.
Absolutely.
Why was that complicated? What did Rawlings tell you?
Well, in the interview which was held with Mr. Rawlings around his own experience of managing first the transition from being a maximum leader of sorts at the head of the PNDC to becoming a politician, as it were, in a multi-party context, I think it was quite revealing that he himself observed that given all of the wind of change that was going on around the world, given the fact that within Ghana itself, pressure had built up considerably, in spite of everything the PNDC was doing by way of development, right? Infrastructure and all of that, renewing the airport in Kotoka International Airport, building roads, investing in health and social services. People were calling for an opening up of the political system. So there was domestic pressure, and on top of it, there was external pressure. In fact, he explicitly mentioned that the Americans, in particular, were on him about opening up the political system.
And this is before 2000?
Yes, in the lead up to his election.
This is before 92?
Yes,
okay.
The lead up to his election.
His own election?
Yes. So that's the first thing. So he said, well, you know, he concluded that to resist it would be foolish. The conditions for the transition were there, and there was some degree of certainty in his circle that they could win an election. They felt popular enough on account of the record of the PNDC that they could win. And so that first transition was easy to undertake. The alternation from the NDC to Mr. Kufour was a different ballgame. Africa celebrated it as one of the first successful set of cases of an incumbent from a ruling party losing to an opposition, and therefore a wholesale movement, not just of the incumbent leader, but of an entire political clan around that leader exiting for a new clan to come in. And I think the key message there was first the degree of reasonable assurance that the exiting group needed to enjoy that there was not going to be a wholesale persecution. And that's what makes a lot of transitions to become a bit fragile.
Yeah, but is that something that the people exiting should hold against the process?
No, not necessarily.
This is a country governed by laws. And so unless, of course, they do not have, do you get the sense that they didn't have confidence in the institutions of, say, the judiciary, which becomes a pivotal platform on which these matters are ventilated, whether or not one will have peace, enjoyment of peace, because it's not a coup transition. It is a democratic transition.
No, not really. From where I sit, and I put it to you essentially to say that a lot of what creates anxiety during periods of transition is actually perception based. It's not so much that there is no prescribed framework for managing a transition, and it's not so much that people are instinctively suspicious of institutions which they helped to create themselves when they were in office, as much as the fact that a perception that is woven in history, and don't forget that there is a history to this. I mean, after all, what was the source of the primary opposition to the PNDC at a point in time? It was significantly the crop that became organized into the MPP, right? And the MPP itself is the inheritor of a political mantle that goes back to the period after the Second World War in Ghana's political history.
Absolutely.
And that tension between the what one might call the broad Nkrumahist tradition and the broad Dankwa tradition in Ghanaian politics was curiously replaying itself in all of this. So behind what you would see as regular and normal processes were the undercurrents of these two competing traditions in the political history of the country.
Let's talk about Ghana, because Ghana has election in a few months' time. In 2008, were the sentiments that Mr. Kufour expressed to you the same as the sentiments that Mr. Rawlings expressed to you relating to Kufour of 2008 and Rawlings of 2000?
One meeting point between the two of them, and they were interviewed separately by the two main authors of the whole project. The first is that in a process of transition, a leader does not only just worry about himself, but also about the entire structure of power around him or her, who have discordant voices. There are discordant voices. And I think sometimes we underestimate.
What does that mean that a leader does not worry?
Just only about himself.
Is there something to worry about when the election is lost and the Constitution prescribes that on 7th January
no.
you have to leave? Is there something to worry about?
I use worry
advisedly.
advisedly, because
so you mean a leader is concerned?
Concerned, yeah.
But why must one be concerned? And you get dressed and you go to the event and you're out.
Yeah, but these are still very young democracies. It's not like David Cameron. David Cameron packing out and carrying boxes and
he's gone.
Yeah, these are still young democracies in the process of consolidating themselves.
I understand that. Yes. I understand the concern that personally the individual would have some challenges, some of it even psychological.
Yes.
Because even in corporate, if an MD of a powerful institution, say the Nigerian Petroleum Authority, is exiting, even with those kinds of transitions,
yes,
in corporate circles,
absolutely,
you would have those things.
Absolutely.
Americans record the very horrible transition of President George Bush 43, when he had lost the election to Bill Clinton. He didn't even attend the inauguration. Yeah, so you have that. Yeah. But my concern is if these sentiments that are very personal to people, and almost every human being will go through that because change is difficult, if these sentiments that are personal to people can be applied to frustrate the institution and the infrastructure of the law, that's worrying.
Well, that
so that Mr. Kufour can think all he wants to think. He can be as concerned and as disappointed as ever, whatever, but that disappointment should not be able to express itself in frustrating the event of the transition. Did you find that?
No,
that there was temptation
I think
to get the transition frustrated one way?
No, I think President Kufour, as you know, is a lawyer by training, was never going to be caught on the side of doing anything that was illegal. But he did have to manage disparate voices within his coalition. And that's where I say that a leader who wants to manage a proper transition in our context must not only be concerned about himself or herself alone, but also looking beyond.
What were those voices saying?
There were voices who said that we didn't lose fair and square. Yeah. We must fight this to the bitter end. We must wait for the whole judicial process and political process to work itself out. There were people who basically were determined that these guys who are purportedly coming to replace us must be frustrated, even to the point of what kind of handing over briefing should take place between the different teams. So it's not a shortage of things, and I think the key message of this book, but the key message of this book, which I really want to put at the center of this conversation, is that every transition that succeeds is the outcome of the exercise of leadership. What does the exercise of leadership mean? It means not just only accepting the outcome and being ready to work with the new authorities with regard to managing a proper transition, but also effectively being ready to abnegate and make sacrifices. Make sacrifices that might mean that even in some instances where you feel that the outcome was not as fair and as free as you would have desired, you still pick up the telephone and congratulate in the bigger interest of a broad project of moving the country in the direction which you all agree is
if we have a president who goes to the election on the ballot and is told that you have lost the election, at the time, mind you, he's still president for at least 1 more month. It means we are in trouble in Ghana.
No, I don't necessarily think so.
Nigeria went through it. Goodluck Jonathan was on the ballot and he exited.
Absolutely.
But in Nigeria, the powers, the godfathers of the country, Obasanjo and others were still in there. They still had control over the military, and significantly, Jonathan didn't have as much control over the military. So the transition occurred. But in other places where
I'm not too worried about Ghana, and I don't have a feeling of apocalypse, even with regard to the next transition that is going to take place, whatever the outcome. And I'll explain why. Precisely because of the experience documented in the book. First, of the transition from a maximum leader of a PNDC to an elected president who served 2 terms, experience was garnered. One of the most important outcomes of that period, which only became obvious when the first transition from Rawlings to Kufour was taking place was the fact that Ghana had managed to build for itself a robust national election management body. Right? I can cite other examples of things that came out of that experience, not in any engineered fashion.
So let's talk about Mr. Kufour's transition, because that was a very complicated transition. It's complicated for many angles that were thrown up in Ghana, which hadn't been thrown up before in elections. So,
well, I think essentially the situation, and it was one which captured imagination around the world. I remember at the time I said to myself that if this had happened in my own native country, it would have been reason for some ambitious military to seek to annul the entire process, or to have a prolonged judicial interpretation, as we had in 1979 over the famous 12 2/3 arithmetical calculation. Around the same kinds of issues, what constituted 12 2/3 of the Federation of Nigeria to enable President Shagari to be sworn into office as the winner of the first election to usher in the Second Republic. But I think one of the things that Mr. Kufour kept repeating is that first and foremost, by temperament, Ghanaians are by and large a peaceful people.
We heard that of Liberians.
Yes, by temperament and of Ivorians.
Yes, and of Ivorians too.
Until it is put to the test. And it was tested. And we did not see a wholesale breakdown of law and order.
Well, banks closed for fear of immigration for few days.
People have fears, legitimate, but we did not see what we saw in Kenya, for example. It wasn't a question of go back to thy tents, O Israel. You have no more space here in Accra. Go back to where you came from. And people in Kumasi will say, well, go back to wherever you came. No more space for you in Kumasi, and that kind of thing. So I think for me, that kind of resonated to the extent to which people were willing to allow the process to run its course to the very end and see what it would yield. And at the end, with the outcome that I must confess was also quite surprising for me, with the outcome that we got, President Mills inaugurated, a willingness to accept. Well, I think behind all of that also was a lot of work which was being done on the leaders.
On the candidates, Kufour who was exiting.
On the candidates, on Kufour, on Rawlings, and on the two.
Yes, Rawlings was an important part of that conversation as well.
Absolutely.
Did Mr. Kufour, did you get the sense, or did your interviewers get a sense that Mr. Kufour at some point had a temptation to do something else to solve the problem?
No.
To present another solution?
No, not at all. It was, to the best of our knowledge, left to the judgment of Mr. Afarijan and his team. And that's why I said that process yielded an outcome in which the authority of the Election Commission of Ghana came out fully enhanced. And from that period, the Ghanaian Election Commission became something of a star globally in terms of, for example, being taken to Liberia, post-conflict Liberia, to help with rebuilding the political process, especially the institution of adjudication and management of elections. Same thing in Sierra Leone. I mean, Mr. Afarijan became essentially a traveling envoy.
The African Electoral Commissioner,
absolutely,
maybe.
Absolutely, effectively in that role. And I think that certainly did add up to strengthen the political culture of the country and the experience of managing transitions. If it had gone in any other direction than the way it went, and the tensions, we all lived the tensions, as you said, pieces of paper calculating and permutating and all of that. It's part of the experience of building a democracy, in my view. And that experience is not lost, even as we move towards December 7. That's why I feel that, for countries that haven't had the opportunity, it's not a textbook thing that you can learn on the pages of, even reading a book like this, until you live it, actually. And you have to make very hard choices. Separately, I remember listening to Afarijan when he was asked about that particular situation. And, he said at the end of the day, He just had to be guided by his conscience. Now, you can imagine the pressure Mr. Afari-Gyan was under. Extreme pressure. And he did say
Pressure to do what?
Oh, pressure to go one way or the other.
But who was putting that pressure?
Oh, the politicians.
But that's what I'm worried about.
Yes.
There has to be powerful people. Did Mr. Kufour put pressure on him?
No, he never mentioned names, and I can understand that he would not mention names.
Yes, but if somebody was putting pressure on him, it is the NPP and the NDC.
It had to be the two main contenders.
And therefore the incumbent president would be one of those.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. There are other political players
when
in the political
parties. When they put pressure on him, what were
parties.
they asking him to do? Change the election results?
No, declare it in one, way or the other. That's 49.9% is, or point whatever percent is good enough, round it. Give a round figure.
And let it be 50.
Yes.
So that Akufo-Addo can win.
Well, round the figure, yeah. And the others saying, this is not going to be possible. This country will be ungovernable, and all the pressures you can imagine that an adjudicator can face.
Why was Afari-Gyan able to survive that pressure?
Integrity. Integrity and the enabling law. After all, the Election Commission is a constitutional body.
I like the law a bit more than integrity, because
Yes.
integrity, as Shakespeare said, we can't read this on a person's face.
True.
But if the laws are not, if the institutions are not strong, and the
Yes.
laws backing them are not strong,
Yes.
then integrity would have a limit.
No, true, but integrity does have its place to the extent to which somebody like an election commission chairperson in whatever country cannot be reproached, for example, on issues of corruption. If you've been collecting money from politicians before a situation like this emerges, it will be that much more difficult for you to sit back and say, guys, can you back off? And we are going to decide. The Constitution gives us the right. And Afari-Gyan would smile, even if he was summoned, to be asked to do one thing or the other, or politicians heading to the Election Commission office. He would
When
smile,
he was telling
stand
the international
his ground.
press and people like you, when Afari-Gyan was telling the international press and people like you about the pressure that he had gone under, did he seem like if the pressure had continued for some time, maybe he would have budged? Or what did he say what his biggest support base?
His number one support was the Constitution.
The law.
The law. And the enabling powers provided for him. Said he could have been right or wrong in his interpretation and judgment. He sought legal opinion and took a decision. And that decision was one he was going to stand by. I don't think he would have budged to pressure, other than that which he thought was in alignment with the law and his conscience.
Those of you who sit outside in international circles, are you nervous about Ghana's election in December?
Given what I have read of Ghana, given what I have heard from actors, given my own observations on the ground, I expect a tight contest. But I know it's not the first time Ghana has had a tight contest. It's going to be a third time, actually, that this will be a closely fought election. And my feeling is that the institutional arrangements are robust enough. They have been tested before, and they are still in place, and they will be able to rise to the challenge.
But we don't have
whatever the challenge. Anymore. We have a new chair. She's a very good woman. I've had the privilege of meeting her soon after she was appointed to the position, cleared through Parliament. And I have no reason to doubt that the integrity and the energy which she brings, together with the infrastructure that Afari-Gyan built, which is still in place, will definitely give the support that is necessary.